After 4 years together, my wife told me she wasn't sure about starting a family with me. Then, right in front of her best friend, she laughed and said, "If you were handsome, I'd actually want to plan a future with you." I didn't hear it from her directly. I found out later, in a way that still makes my stomach twist. And on moving day, her sister called me in tears. Before I get into how my marriage unraveled and how I ended up standing alone in an apartment that no longer felt like home, do me a quick favor, hit subscribe, leave a comment about where you're watching from, and help this story reach people who might need to hear it. I'm Daniel. I'm 32 years old, and until recently, I thought I knew exactly where my life was going. Olivia and I had been together for 4 years, married for just over 1. We met in Madison at a mutual friends game night, bonding over our shared hatred of overly hoppy beers and our mutual love of old animated movies from the 90s. It was easy with her from the start. Comfortable. The kind of connection that doesn't feel like fireworks but more like warmth that slowly settles into your bones. We took our time with everything. Dated for 2 years before moving into our place at Lakeview Flats, adopted our dog Milo the following spring, and got married in a small courthouse ceremony with close family and friends. Nothing extravagant. That was kind of our thing. Simple. Practical. Or at least I thought it was. For most of our relationship, we were on the same page about the future. Maybe kids someday. Not immediately, but eventually. A house outside the city. Stability. Nothing flashy. Over the last 6 months, though, something shifted. At first, it was subtle. When friends announced pregnancies, Olivia's smile would look forced, her attention drifting to her phone. When I casually mentioned timelines or savings plans, she'd change the subject or joke it away. I told myself I was overthinking it. Stress at work, maybe. She'd started a new project at her construction firm, and I knew deadlines were tight. I work in client services for a medical billing company, so I'm no stranger to pressure. Life gets busy. Couples adjust. But the comments started creeping in. "Do you ever think about?" "I don't know, improving yourself a little," she asked one night while scrolling through her phone. I laughed it off, thinking she meant the gym or maybe a new haircut. She didn't clarify, and I didn't push. That was a pattern I didn't recognize at the time, me not pushing. She began going out more with her friend Rachel, long dinners and drinks that stretched late into the night. I didn't mind. Everyone needs space. When she came home, though, she seemed distant, distracted, like she was somewhere else even when she was sitting right next to me on the couch. One Friday evening, I tried to reset things. I made reservations at Rosso Verde, the Italian place downtown she loved, picked up her favorite dessert on the way home, and even cleaned the apartment top to bottom. I wanted us to talk. Really talk. Dinner didn't go the way I'd hoped. She barely touched her food, kept glancing at her phone, and when I finally asked if everything was okay, she sighed like I'd asked something exhausting. "I don't know if I'm ready for all this," she said quietly. "The planning. The expectations. The family stuff." I asked her what she meant. She shrugged and said she wasn't sure about kids anymore. Not with things the way they were. That hit harder than I expected. We'd talked about this for years. I asked if she meant timing or if she meant me. She didn't answer directly. Instead, she mentioned how some of her friends were trapped in unhappy marriages, how people change, how life doesn't always turn out the way you plan. The conversation ended without resolution. We drove home in silence. She slept on the couch that night, saying she needed space to think. The next day, she went out with Rachel again. I stayed home with Milo, pacing the apartment, replaying every conversation from the past few months and wondering when things had started slipping through my fingers. That evening, my phone buzzed with a message from Megan, a coworker of mine who happened to be friends with Rachel's cousin. It was short and awkward, asking if I was okay. When I called her, she hesitated before telling me what she'd heard. Apparently, Olivia and Rachel had been talking earlier that day. Laughing. Drinking. And when Rachel asked why Olivia seemed unsure about family planning with me, Olivia joked, that if I were more handsome, she'd feel more excited about building a future. Megan sounded uncomfortable even repeating it. She said Rachel laughed, but it was the kind of laugh that fills space rather than agreement. I sat on the edge of my bed for a long time after that call, Milo resting his head on my knee, completely unaware that my entire sense of self had just been reduced to a punchline in someone else's conversation. When Olivia came home later that night, she acted like everything was normal. Kissed my cheek. Asked what I wanted for dinner the next day. I didn't confront her. Not yet. I needed to understand how the woman I loved could speak about me like that without hesitation. The next morning, her sister Emily called me. She was crying so hard I could barely understand her at first. She said she was sorry. That I didn't deserve what was happening. That Olivia had been spiraling and dragging everyone else into it. That was when I realized this wasn't just a bad comment or a rough patch. This was the beginning of the end. Emily's call stayed with me long after I hung up. The sound of her crying, the way she kept apologizing like any of this was her fault, made everything feel heavier and more real. She didn't give me details, just said she couldn't stay quiet anymore and that I should take care of myself. When the line went dead, I sat there staring at my phone, trying to understand how my marriage had turned into something people whispered about behind my back. When Olivia woke up later that morning, she acted like the night before hadn't happened. She made coffee, scrolled through her phone, and asked if I wanted to run errands together. I watched her move around the kitchen, familiar and distant at the same time, and wondered how long she'd been carrying doubts she never shared with me. I told her I wasn't feeling great and needed some air. She barely looked up when she said okay. I drove aimlessly for a while, ending up at Harbor Market, the big store we always went to when we were stressed. I pushed a cart through the aisles without really seeing anything, grabbing things we didn't need just to give my hands something to do. New pillows. A candle that smelled like cedar. Dog treats for Milo. It felt ridiculous, but the normalcy helped keep me from unraveling in public. By the time I got back to the apartment, Olivia was gone again. I found a note on the counter saying she was at Rachel's place and would be back later. No heart. No emoji. Just information. I sat on the couch and replayed Megan's words in my head, trying to decide whether to confront Olivia immediately or wait until I could trust myself not to explode. That night, she came home late, clearly a little buzzed, her mood lighter than it had been in weeks. She talked about something funny Rachel had said, about plans for an upcoming weekend, about a show she wanted us to watch. I listened, nodding, feeling like I was watching a performance meant for someone else. When she finally noticed how quiet I was, she asked what was wrong. I told her I knew. At first, she genuinely looked confused. Then I repeated the comment. Word for word. I watched her face change in real time, the confusion replaced by irritation, then something closer to embarrassment. She sighed and rubbed her forehead. That wasn't meant for you to hear, she said. That was the first thing she said. Not I'm sorry. Not I didn't mean it. Just that it wasn't meant for me to hear. She insisted it was a joke, that she'd been venting, that Rachel knew not to take her seriously. She said everyone complained sometimes, that it didn't mean anything. When I asked how joking about my looks fit into doubts about starting a family with me, she snapped that I was overreacting and turning one comment into a crisis. The argument spiraled fast. I asked her if she found me unattractive. She said that wasn't the point. I asked if she wanted a future with me. She said she didn't know. That she felt pressured. That everyone expected her to want certain things just because she was married. I told her I wasn't everyone. I was her husband. That seemed to make her angrier. She accused me of making everything about myself, of not understanding how trapped she felt by expectations she never asked for. She said she needed space to figure out who she was and what she wanted, and that my constant need for reassurance was exhausting. That hurt more than the joke. She slept on the couch again that night. I barely slept at all. Milo paced between us, confused by the tension, finally curling up against my chest like he was trying to hold me together. The next day, I called in sick to work. I couldn't imagine sitting at my desk answering emails like nothing was wrong. Instead, I drove to my brother Aaron's place in Verona. Aaron has always been my anchor, the person who doesn't sugarcoat things but never lets me feel alone. When I told him what Olivia had said, his jaw tightened in a way that told me exactly what he was thinking. He wanted to confront her. Immediately. I talked him out of it, explaining that yelling wouldn't fix anything and that I needed clarity, not chaos. He let it go, but only after making it clear that his couch was mine for as long as I needed it. Throughout the day, Olivia texted. Apologies mixed with defensiveness. She said she hadn't meant to hurt me, that she was just confused, that everything felt like too much. I responded once, telling her I needed time to think and that I'd be staying with Aaron for a bit. She didn't reply after that. Monday morning, I woke up on Aaron's couch to a missed call from Susan, Olivia's mom. We'd always had a decent relationship, polite and warm if not particularly close. Seeing her name pop up made my stomach knot. I called her back, and she immediately asked if we could meet for coffee. Her voice sounded strained, like she'd been crying. We agreed on Blue Ember Cafe later that afternoon. I spent the hours before the meeting pacing Aaron's living room, replaying every moment of my relationship with Olivia. I wondered how many times I'd brushed off discomfort because it was easier than rocking the boat. How often I'd assumed silence meant peace instead of avoidance. When I got to the cafe, Susan was already there, sitting stiffly at a corner table. She looked older somehow, more tired than I remembered. After some awkward small talk, she took a deep breath and told me she needed to be honest with me, even if it hurt. She said Olivia had called her the night before our argument, crying and saying she didn't know if she wanted the life she'd built. That she felt disconnected. That she'd been questioning everything for months. Susan admitted she'd tried to encourage Olivia to talk to me, to go to counseling, to slow down instead of letting resentment fester. Then she said something that made my chest tighten. Olivia had mentioned another name. Not in a confession. Not as an affair. But as someone she compared me to. Someone at work who made her feel understood in ways she felt I didn't anymore. Susan said she didn't know all the details, only that Olivia's doubts hadn't come out of nowhere. I sat there, numb, staring at the table while Susan apologized again and again for her daughter's behavior. She said she loved me and that whatever happened, I didn't deserve to be treated like an afterthought. When I left the cafe, my phone buzzed with a message from Emily. She said she was glad I'd met with their mom. She said Olivia was packing some things and talking about staying with Rachel for a while. That night, alone in Erin's guest room, I finally let myself cry. Not just for the marriage that was clearly slipping away, but for the version of myself who'd believed love alone was enough to carry two people forward. By the time I fell asleep, one truth had settled in: whatever came next, things could never go back to the way they were. The next morning, I woke up with that strange, hollow calm that comes after you've cried yourself empty. My phone was on the floor beside the couch where I'd fallen asleep, face down, like it was deliberately hiding from me. For a few seconds, I let myself pretend none of this was real, that I was just staying at Erin's place because of a late night, that Olivia and I were fine, that we'd argue and then laugh it off like we always used to. Then I remembered Susan's face at the cafe. The hesitation in her voice when she mentioned that other name. The calm cracked. I picked up my phone. A handful of notifications. 2 missed calls from Olivia. 1 text from Rachel, which I didn't open. And a long message from Emily sent sometime after midnight. Emily wrote that Olivia had shown up at her apartment crying, dragging a suitcase behind her like she was running from a fire. She said Olivia talked for hours, circling the same points: confusion, pressure, fear of settling for the wrong life. Emily said she tried to be supportive, but at some point she couldn't hold it in anymore. She told Olivia that mocking me, even as a joke, was cruel and unfair. According to Emily, that was when Olivia snapped. She accused Emily of taking my side, of not understanding what it was like to feel trapped. Emily apologized to me again for being in the middle of it. She said she loved her sister, but she loved me too, and watching Olivia tear everything apart without taking responsibility was breaking her heart. I stared at the message for a long time. Emily's loyalty meant more than I expected, but it also made everything heavier. This wasn't just between Olivia and me anymore. It was spreading outward, dragging everyone into its wake. Around noon, Olivia finally called. I almost let it go to voicemail, but something told me this conversation couldn't be avoided any longer. Her voice sounded small, nothing like the confident tone she used with her friends. She asked how I was doing, like we were catching up after a normal weekend apart. I told her I'd met with her mom. There was a pause on the line so long I wondered if the call had dropped. She told you, Olivia said finally. I asked her what she'd meant when she talked about someone else. Not accusing. Just asking. The way I might have months ago, before everything hardened. She exhaled sharply. It's not what you think, she said. Nothing happened. I told her that wasn't the question. She admitted there was a guy at work, someone she collaborated with on a long project. She said they talked a lot, complained about deadlines, shared jokes. She insisted it never crossed a line, that she never cheated, emotionally or otherwise. But then she said something that landed harder than any confession. He just made things feel easier, she said. Like I didn't have to explain myself all the time. I closed my eyes. I thought about all the nights I'd tried to check in with her, all the times I'd asked what she needed, and how often she'd brushed me off or changed the subject. I asked her why she hadn't talked to me about feeling disconnected. She said she didn't know how. That every time she thought about it, she pictured everything collapsing and panicked. That joking, venting, deflecting felt safer than honesty. And the comment about my looks? I asked. She went quiet again. When she spoke, her voice wavered. She said it had been stupid and mean and rooted in her own insecurity, not my appearance. She said she felt like she was losing control of her life, and saying something cruel made her feel powerful for a moment. I didn't know what to do with that. I told her I needed space. Real space. Not a night on the couch or a weekend apart. Time to think without daily conversations reopening the same wounds. She cried then, said she was scared of losing me, said she loved me, said she'd do anything to fix this. I told her love wasn't the issue. Respect was. We hung up without resolving anything. Just an agreement to give each other a few days. That afternoon, Erin came home early and found me sitting at the kitchen table staring at nothing. He didn't ask questions. He just made coffee and sat across from me until I started talking on my own. When I told him about the coworker, he shook his head slowly. Even if nothing happened, he said, she checked out before she told you. That's not on you. Later that evening, Rachel finally texted. Her message was awkward and overly casual, like she was trying to pretend nothing serious had happened. She said she was sorry if anything she'd said or laughed at caused problems. She added that Olivia had been under a lot of stress and didn't mean it the way it sounded. I didn't reply. The next day blurred into the one after that. I went back to work, moving through my tasks on autopilot. Megan noticed something was off and asked if I was okay. I said I was dealing with personal stuff. She nodded, the universal workplace acknowledgement that meant don't worry, but also don't ask for details. On Thursday night, Emily called again. She sounded exhausted. She told me Olivia had been spiraling, alternating between blaming herself and blaming everyone else. She said Olivia kept asking if I'd forgive her, if things could go back to normal, if this was just a rough patch. Emily's voice cracked when she said, I don't think she understands what she broke. That was when something shifted inside me. Up until that moment, part of me had still been clinging to the idea that with enough talking, enough counseling, enough effort, we could rewind to before the joke, before the doubts, before the comparison. But hearing Emily say that made me realize this wasn't about one mistake. It was about a pattern of avoidance and cruelty that had finally surfaced. That night, alone on Erin's couch, I opened a note on my phone and started writing things down. Not accusations. Facts. She mocked me instead of talking to me. She shared doubts with others before sharing them with me. She questioned our future without inviting me into the conversation. She felt understood by someone else because she stopped letting me understand her. Seeing it laid out like that was brutal, but also clarifying. The following morning, Olivia texted asking if we could meet and talk in person. She suggested a coffee shop near our apartment. Neutral ground. Public. Safe. I agreed. When I arrived, she was already there, sitting by the window, twisting a napkin between her fingers. She looked tired. Smaller somehow. For a second, my chest ached with the urge to comfort her, to reach across the table and remind her we were a team. Instead, I sat down and asked her one question. Are your doubts about the future about marriage in general, or about building a family with me? She hesitated. Just a second too long. That's not fair, she said. It's the only thing that matters, I replied. She admitted that while she was scared of commitment in general, part of her wondered if we were right for each other anymore. She talked about how we'd both changed since our 20s. How I'd become more structured, more focused on planning. How she felt like she'd lost her sense of freedom. I told her people grow. That growth isn't a failure unless you stop growing together. She didn't argue with that. She just looked down at her coffee. That was when I knew. I told her I didn't think we should be married anymore. Not like this. Not with doubt hanging between us like a third person in the room. I said we could take time apart and see what clarity brought, but I wasn't willing to keep living in a marriage where I was an option instead of a choice. She cried. I stayed. I didn't yell. I didn't insult her. I just told the truth. When we left the cafe, we hugged awkwardly, like strangers who still remembered each other's shape. She said she'd stay with Rachel for a while. I said I'd come by the apartment later to get some of my things. As I walked back to my car, I felt devastated, and oddly steady. Like I'd finally stopped fighting the current and let myself reach shore, scraped and bruised, but alive. I didn't go back to the apartment that night. After the conversation at the cafe, the idea of walking into a space that still smelled like Olivia's shampoo and held the echo of a life we'd planned together felt unbearable. I drove back to Erin's place instead, parked in the driveway, and just sat there with the engine off, hands on the steering wheel, letting the silence wrap around me. For the first time since all of this started, my phone stayed quiet. No texts. No calls. No apologies layered with justifications. That silence hurt, but it also felt honest. It was the sound of something finally pausing after weeks of emotional whiplash. The next morning, I woke up early and made coffee before Erin was even up. I sat at his kitchen table watching the light shift through the window, thinking about how strange it was that life could feel so fragile and so grounded at the same time. I'd lost the future I thought I was building, but I was still here. Breathing. Functioning. Able to choose what happened next. Olivia and I met 2 days later to handle the practical things. We chose a small coffee shop halfway between Erin's place and our apartment. It felt deliberate, neutral territory, no memories attached. She looked tired but composed, like someone bracing herself for impact. We talked about the lease first. My name was on it, so she agreed to move out. She said she'd take only what she'd bought herself and leave the rest. We discussed separating our finances, closing the joint account, dividing subscriptions. The conversation was oddly calm, almost businesslike. At one point, she reached across the table, stopped herself, and pulled her hand back. "I really am sorry," she said quietly. "For all of it." I believed her. Or at least, I believed she meant it in that moment. But I also knew apology and repair aren't the same thing. I told her I hoped she figured out what she wanted, truly, before hurting anyone else the way she'd hurt me. She nodded, eyes glossy, and said she hoped I found someone who never made me question my worth. We hugged briefly when we left. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't cinematic. It was just the end of something that had already been breaking for a long time. That afternoon, Emily called again. This time, she wasn't crying. She sounded steady, resolved. She told me Olivia had moved into Rachel's place temporarily and that things were tense there. Emily apologized once more, not because she needed to, but because she's the kind of person who feels things deeply and takes responsibility even when it isn't hers to carry. She said something that stuck with me. "I don't think my sister ever learned how to sit with discomfort. She runs from it until it turns into something ugly." I thanked her for her honesty and for calling me when she did. We promised to stay in touch, regardless of what happened with Olivia. That meant more to me than I expected. Over the next week, I slowly started disentangling my life. I went back to the apartment while Olivia was out and packed my essentials, clothes, documents, my laptop, Milo's things. The apartment felt hollow, like a stage after the actors have left. I didn't linger. I took what I needed and left the rest behind. Work became a strange refuge. Answering emails, sitting in meetings, handling routine problems, it all felt grounding. Megan checked in on me a few times, never prying, just making sure I was okay. I realized how grateful I was for people who respected boundaries without disappearing. Aaron let me stay as long as I needed, but after 2 weeks, I knew it was time to find my own place. I started looking for apartments, something smaller and more affordable. The rental market was rough, but eventually I found a modest one-bedroom on the other side of Madison. Nothing fancy. Just clean, quiet, and mine. Moving day came faster than I expected. That morning, as I was loading boxes into my car, my phone rang. It was Emily. She was crying again. At first, I panicked, thinking something terrible had happened. But through her tears, she explained that Olivia had finally admitted how deep her doubts went and how long she'd been avoiding them. Emily said she was heartbroken, not just for me, but for the sister she barely recognized anymore. She apologized again, said she wished she could fix everything, said she hated how things ended. I stood there in the parking lot, surrounded by cardboard boxes and the quiet hum of a normal day going on around me, and listened. I told her none of this was her fault. That I appreciated her honesty more than she knew. That sometimes things don't end because someone is evil, but because they're unwilling to face themselves. She cried harder at that, then laughed weakly and said she hoped one day we'd both look back on this and understand it better. After we hung up, I finished loading the car and drove to my new apartment. I carried boxes up the stairs one by one, sweating, out of breath, oddly focused. When everything was inside, I locked the door, leaned against it, and finally let myself feel it. The grief came in waves. Not dramatic sobbing, but quiet moments where something small, a song on the radio, an empty space on the couch, the absence of Milo's leash by the door, would hit me unexpectedly. I learned not to fight those moments. I let them pass through me, reminding myself that missing what you hoped for doesn't mean you were wrong to want it. I started therapy a few weeks later. Not because I felt broken, but because I didn't want to repeat the same patterns. In those sessions, I talked about how easily I'd minimized my own needs to keep peace, how I'd ignored early signs of disconnection because confronting them felt scarier than tolerating discomfort. My therapist helped me see that self-respect isn't loud or aggressive, it's quiet and firm, and it doesn't negotiate with contempt. Olivia and I spoke only once more after that, to finalize the last paperwork. It was brief and civil. She told me she was considering therapy too. I hope she followed through, not for my sake, but for hers. Life didn't magically become easy. Some days, I felt free and optimistic. Other days, I felt lonely and disoriented. But slowly, the balance shifted. I cooked meals I liked. I redecorated my new place with things that made me comfortable, not things chosen to please someone else. I took Milo on longer walks. I reconnected with friends I'd drifted from without even realizing it. One evening, a couple of months later, I caught my reflection in the bathroom mirror and paused. I looked tired, but steadier. Like someone who'd been through something hard and survived it without becoming bitter. That felt like a win. If you've made it this far, thank you for listening to my story. If you're in a relationship where you feel small, mocked, or uncertain of your place, please hear this. Love should never make you feel like a punchline. If this story resonated with you, take a moment to subscribe, leave a comment about where you're watching from, and help this reach someone who might need the reminder that they deserve to be chosen fully, not halfway.